Yeah, great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about a little bit about my work, about things that I love. First disclaimer: this will take 22 minutes, not 20. And as a preamble, I have a preamble and also a spoiler. So as a preamble, I would like to state that something that certainly you already know, but typology can be a knowledge process, retrospective, and typology can be an operative process, prospective, but also typology can be convenient. This means that typology is preceded by some sort of organization of knowledge, of classification of knowledge that should or try to obey certain criteria that are established by the author according to a certain agenda. We have very nice examples of classification. We have Georges Perec that teaches us how to classify your books in your library, but he still adds they work only by combination when we put them together, not by single attributes. We also have another beautiful example, Foucault, that quotes Borges when he says that he quotes a certain Chinese encyclopedia, how the emperor classifies the animals, but still in that small quotation, it ends very briefly: the exotic charm of another system of thought is the limitation of our own, the stark impossibility of thinking that. And this, I think, is quite brilliant. And convenient, we know that Giancarlo Argan in '59, before the famous On Typology in Architecture of '63, he writes, one can designate as many typological classes as one wishes. Or Jean-Marc Lamounière, 20 years later, someone very known in this school, would write, les scénarios de la recherche se moulent sur les concepts mêmes que l'auteur veut dégager ou projeter. And we would say, he continues, typological research décrypte en les codifiant les objets architecturaux pour les regrouper selon des classes hypothétiques. Even if, yeah, you understood. Okay. And so what is interesting is that architects and, how does this thing works? Okay. Yeah, architects and even archaeologists, they seem to agree. It's possible to type automobiles on the basis of the length of the scratches in their paint, to classify sand-tempered potsherds on the number of sand grains in each, or to group together all chipped stone points which have side notches. It would be possible, but the pertinent question is, so what? So I will not maybe try to answer to this, and also to question this dominant conception of typology as unit and see it more as diversity. And putting aside all these questions of study and classification here, spoiler alert, these three images are related. My talk is a small lecture. It's called Climatic Affinities, or Type as a Structure of Relations based on the Typological Transfer, in the work of Lacaton Vassal and other similar precedents. And so I like to explore typological manifestations as a support to design that have an operative background to the conception of architecture. So within architecture, I will try somehow to debunk restrictive definitions of type, go beyond functional or formal boundaries toward a more holistic approach. If understanding types, and I quote again Argan in '63, is to recognize a common root form, what happens if what happens when two artifacts with different roots are placed side by side? And so we'll try to approach this. Again, Argan typology might not be a determining factor, but it is an evidence. And I will invite you to look at the evidence. And in the work of Lacaton Vassal, part one, we have three parts, where we find evidences that explore the operative principles of typological transfer in the early works of Lacaton Vassal. Although they never address it directly in their discourse, I argue that this typological transfer is a fundamental element in their work, and that it became operative in their argumentation to the point of impossible dissociation. I would also like to suggest a different understanding of types beyond spatial structure, functional labeling, or typal image. Lacaton Vassal typological transfer is holistic, and I suspect that takes all these elements together. And so we will explore this with some case studies, with some pieces of evidence. Another disclaimer, I study with them under their guidance. I was then a teaching assistant, so yeah, someone can say, yeah, he's biased, maybe a little bit, but I'm also very critical because this allows me to understand the limitations of their process. And so, Lacaton Vassal, they are French practice for those who are not familiar with. They won the prix in 21 and 2 years ago, and their most known projects are the Palais Tokyo, the Tour Bois-le-Prêtre, or even before the House La Tapie, which is my first piece of evidence. The House La Tapie, and starting with this piece of evidence, I'll try to show this typological transfer à part entière. And I will also conclude by showing that a type in architecture can carry perhaps some meaning or some ideological values. And so just comment a little bit the project. You can read it with me. It's a simple volume, almost square in plan, 11 by 12 is for a house, for a family of four members. The program, it's a square 10 by 11 in Bordeaux. It's organized in two parts, in two rectangles that you can more or less already guess. And in terms of functions inside or uses, we will have a block that has the technical part and also the vertical and the stair box, a kitchen, sanitaries, and then it's split slightly. It tends to split in two spaces, one slightly bigger. On the ground floor, séjour is marqué and garage brackets. And also on the top floor, two sleeping zones. All of this opens to a second rectangle. It's called la serre, so greenhouse, that has a double height. Very big openings. We'll understand better also in section. Here we have the first volume, which is heated. All of this is metallic structure. The core part, the heated part, is sandwich panels of wood, and the second is metallic structure and polycarbonate ondulate panels, very used in greenhouses. So what are the particularities? The particularities, of course, you can already guess, is that the space in the séjour doubles and also the volume doubles. And the process is guided, of course, by a will to overcome limitations of space linked to somehow this domestic dwelling, and also a very strict budget. Evidence number two, before the La Tapie house, there was a La Tapie house. So this is the first version on your right. The first conceived version for the La Tapie house in 91. It was a rectangular plan, 12 by 9. You'll see the plan afterwards, but it was also for the same clients, of course. And the principle was concrete base, and on top of that concrete base, Lacaton Vassal, they proposed to place a greenhouse out of a catalog, a standard catalog, inside two wooden volumes, isolated wooden volumes, where the same program would fit. I have a plan here. No, I don't have a plan, but with rooms, living room, and then 3 rooms on the top, and even a terrace on the top of the smaller volume. These would be inside of this big space, would work like a certain buffer zone. This first project of the La Tapie house was abandoned due to budget. It was 10% too much what the family could afford. At the time, this would cost 55,000 euros. Today, this would be 84,000 euros for 180 square meters of living space. And so we can see already here somehow the genesis of the use of greenhouses for domestic space. It's not linear where this came from. We have little bits of information. One is that, of course, they talked a lot about the clients, about their wishes, where they would spend their holidays and what type of climate they would enjoy. There's also the diploma project of Jean-Philippe Vassal in Bordeaux, which also proposed some kind of greenhouse buffer zones in the city. And then there's also the African period of Jean-Philippe Vassal and Lacaton in Niamey that is referred several times in a lot of interviews, and somehow it's also used to is also declining several themes in their own work because of the management of climate conditions in Niamey and the management of everyday life situations with scarce resources. I'll jump to evidence number two, oh yeah, the one is 1B, which is the number two, Maison à Cotteret in 2000, 7 years after. It's maybe the most radical, or at least the most pertinent from a typological transfer perspective, this house in Cotteret in France. It's an architectural region. There is a narrow plant and the house is set back from the neighbor houses. It's adjectivated as a second low budget project of Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal. It is the simple juxtaposition of two greenhouses, metallic structure, rigid translucent panels, natural ventilation system with motorized flaps, sliding side panels like every single greenhouse that you know, and it gives this potential of opening 50% of the lateral envelope, and they are placed side by side. Again, one has a box, an insulated box inside, as you see there, very simple, séjour, chambre de bloc, bureau, and the second one is the second volume, the second greenhouse. It's very clear in plan, and the second volume has really earth inside, a natural ground like a greenhouse, and it serves as a winter garden, but also as an extension of the domestic space. 69,000 euros, what we today 95,000 euros for 300 square meters of housing. And the particularity, of course, is direct use without intervention or modification of a pair of professional horticultural greenhouses. There is a constant in these intentions and the discourse. What is done is what is said. Essentially, these are related with the living spacing dimension. For Lacaton Vassal, more is better, double is kind of the new black. And case study number 3, where you'll find out if it works for one family, does it work for 12 families? On the right side, I had a section of the Projet of Mulhouse. Is the first test of the greenhouse applied to collective housing. It was a HLM project for the extension of the Mulhouse city ouvrière. There were 5 teams of architects invited. They got a plot. It was fashioned to invite a lot of teams to work on projects, and they got a plot. And what they do is kind of they took, and you can see it speaks for itself, the Latapie principle expanded, apparently, but in this case with an intermediate floor. You've seen more or less this on the single moment. Similar solutions to all apartments, double-sided cross-through units. Dimension-wise, it's very interesting that it is the greenhouse that dimensions this socle, this concrete base. So this means that the units are very deep. Also in plant, the height of 3 meters, it was determined by this, very deep for plants, and finally also more space. And in a time where Europe was celebrating architects and was trying to see who Guggenheim's the best, these guys were installing greenhouses and transforming 75 square meter apartment for 3 rooms into 145 square meters and 40 square meters of greenhouse. Again, the same principle. Heated space and an extension zone protected by polycarbonate translucent panels. I'll just show this. It's kind of a parenthèse in mind. This gets even further, this idea of typological transfer. On the right side, you have the proposal of that got built afterwards, but also created a big fuzz between architects and organizers. Their proposal for Documenta 12 in Kassel 2016, where they installed a huge amount of greenhouses where works were exposed inside. This created a big clash because it was they were not respecting the need of conditions, interior conditions for the works of art. Tension at the moment, this disappeared from Lacaton Vassal website, comes again, but still is assumed as a project. But it demonstrates how this type of typological transfer can be very sensitive when it's not really understood. What all of this has in common is that somehow the same, excluding now documented, but the others, we have the same programmatic content, housing the same set of assumptions, freedom of movement, generosity of space, more is better, atmospheric richness, simplicity of solutions, the same ideological positions. Living space has accessible right to everyone, and also, maybe the most important, a kind of triptych notion of climate space, heated, temperate, and exterior space. This is then applied to several programmatic programs like Nantes School. You'll find it. The first hut in Niamey of Jean-Philippe Vassal, you also find it. These 3 levels of space. So these two artifacts are different types that are placed side by side, creating a reciprocal relations where their initial nature is deeply affected. It seems they overcome the idea of dominant type. Each part of the relation enhances and expands the attribute of the other. And then quoting again, back to Argan, on the typology of architecture, and I quote, type supports a scheme of spatial articulation that is a response to the totality of practical and ideological demands of the architects. I'm adding, and this idea of the holistic that I was trying to propose. The greenhouse is a nectar of ideas and ideology that is constantly explored independently of the functional requirements or purposes. And this is why, and I argue that on the greenhouse type, Lacaton Vassal formalized an abstract notion that builds on the structure of relations between spaces. It goes beyond the formal definition of the original typal image, but still explores its attribute. It's the capacity to conceive new spaces independently of their own functions, allows types to be exchanged and affected by different functions. Of course, this is not linear. Somehow there is the appropriateness, the quality of being suitable that is later verified when the system of social relations of a function matches the spatial relations that that type allows. And I expect it was not clear, then we can discuss on this. Part two, where another analogous piece of evidence also suggests the potential of typological transfer between domestic space and greenhouses. We go back in time to 76. There is a group of German group called Log ID that is interested on greenhouses and passive heating systems, and is part of the generation that want to somehow get back to nature. And they are deeply interested in the symbiosis between humans and plants. In 1965, one of the members, Dieter Schemp, sets to explore the potential of horticultural greenhouses for human habitations. On autumn of 76, Dieter Schemp found a greenhouse in the Tübingen region, two juxtaposed elements, like you see, 20 by 10 meters, so a total of 400 square meters, where he would like, where he moves his home and also his architectural office. In '83, they published a book, which is kind of a log book that details the observation, the notes, everything related to this experience, because of what Dieter Schemp at the time says, the lack of literature on how can dwelling be set in another type of building. Though I'll just very quickly read, because it's really beautiful, some entries of this logbook. 6th of September 76, the deck is placed in the greenhouse between tomatoes that are still there, high humidity, everything gets damp, drawing is almost impossible. 17th of September 76, the material has arrived and I start working. The heat differences are very large in the room, the body feels uncomfortable, there are many beetles and caterpillars. Weekend, the climate has completely worn me out physically. 2 November 76, the office is set up, it rains slightly but steadily inside. 11 November 76, today is my first day of work at the office, everything works. 14th of November 76, the moisture problem has not yet been solved, the drawing paper is curling, the flowers are growing. 7th of April 77, the glass house is not ventilated, the sun is shining, inside temperature at 12 o'clock is 48 degrees Celsius. By opening the ventilation, it immediately drops to 24. And so the architecture of the greenhouse evolves according to the vegetation. This is one set of the program at the time. The idea is, of course, to cohabit. He was really interested in this symbiosis, what type of plants could go inside, and somehow the vegetation will also unifies in a growing continuum, but also divides into zones, functional zones. People should move freely. And so Dieter Schemp and Martin Krampen took note of these conclusions, of this observation. And I'm going to try first showing some images and then summarize this. With the beginning of the spring, you can live anywhere in the green area, depending on your needs and preference. You can go into the sun or the shade. You can even hang an hammock in a nice spot when it's still cold outside. In winter, the living area becomes smaller because only on really sunny days can you go to the green area for afternoon tea. Living in a glass house has no rigid functional sequence, just as everyone's living needs are constantly changing anyway. And finally, they write, the luxury of unused space. And this is very interesting because we start to see kind of a pattern of ideas, of intentions that we already previously see in the first evidence, in the first part. And finally, they conclude the luxury of unused space. This was also an attempt to change ideas and concepts. The room changes independently. Rooms change in space through the growing and dying phases of plants. This experiment, so in the book that I showed you, they proposed 6 types that explore this, and they even propose solutions for post-war housing bars where this type of structures, log ID says, could turn concrete silos more human. Even, and I quote, an inhabitant on the 10th floor has the right to have a garden. And here we have a small sketch of these building blocks and some solutions based on greenhouse structures. Beyond the qualities, this constructed idea, they write, make it possible to reduce the overall costs. Little jump in time, Tourbois-Prêtre, intervention of Lacaton Vassal, exploring the same similar principles of the greenhouse. Part 3, where it will be shown that in the past, greenhouses and the domestic space have had similar relations, suggesting identical climatic affinities. We'll move now a little bit more in time to 18th century. The relation between domestic space and conservatories experienced a strong movement, in particular since the invention of steel and glass greenhouses. From covered passage to galleries, from galleries to conservatories, from conservatories to greenhouses, from freestanding objects to necessary extension of the house, this becomes an artifact almost inseparable of the domestic space. Change happens, books and treatises are written, knowledge is spread. And I'll just quote just a few examples to finish. In the writings of 2 landscape architects at the time, John Claudius Loudon and Humphrey Repton, Scottish and in English, that allows a little bit to feel, if I may say, the temperature in the room. A greenhouse, which 50 years ago was a luxury not often to be met with, is now become an appendage to every villa and to many town residents, not indeed one of the first necessity, but one which is felt to be appropriate and highly desirable, and which mankind recognizes as a mark of elegant and refined enjoyment, this idea of pleasure that is already there. And also, according to our ideas of enjoyments of the greenhouse, this is very interesting. There are recommendations where to place it. It is essential that it to be situated close to the house, not merely near, but adjoining it and attach it either by being placed against it or forming part of the edifice, or by means of a corridor, a veranda, or some other description of covered passage. The most desirable situation is unquestionably that in which the greenhouse shall communicate with and form, as it were, as an additional apartment to the library or a breakfast parlor. And I continue. If it communicates by spacious glass doors, the effect will be greatly highlighted. Verdure, gray colors, and fragrance blended with books, sofas, and all the accompaniments of social and polished life. This idea of extension of the social life of the house, of domestic space, goes into the greenhouse. And also, just to complement another idea from Humphrey Repton, fragments on the theory and practice of landscape gardening, and he writes, these rooms have been opened into each other in suite by large folding doors, and the effect of disenfilade or visto through a modern house is occasionally increased by a conservatory at one hand and repeated by a large mirror at the opposite hand. But all the improvements in modern luxury, whether belonging to the architect's or landscape gardener's department, none is more delightful than the connection of living rooms with the greenhouse or conservatory. Just finished, 2 sketches are introduced, show the contrast between the ancient cedar parlor and the modern living room. No drawing can describe those comforts enjoying in the later, or the silent gloom of the former. And Renton, that used to do red books with observations and proposals to their clients that would kind of being a compendium of his knowledge, trying to get also a job, like a very marketing attitude. He draws a lot this before and after montage. Here, the gloom parlor, and here, this new space that opens up, that expands the domestic interior into the greenhouse. I'll let you do the connections. Final considerations, loose ends, and so what? This multiplies a little bit. There are a lot of angles of attack, of discussion, as you can see. I'll just try to summarize some of them related in 3 levels. The first level, Lacaton Vassal's work, typological transfer has become an operative principle that influences the conception of interior space independently of formal or functional requirements. It's not limited to the transfer of attributes between types. It's not limited to transfer of spatial characteristics or formal outlines, or the transfer of just typal images, and this Moneo would call broken types, referring to Venturi. One could also look at Sterling Visions ab Centrum. I take the outline of a cathedral and I put offices inside and expect, or I try to defend I'm working with types. Monero is a little allergic to these broken types. I think Lacaton, they really try to overcome also this idea because they respect that, and that's why I was trying to suggest that typological transfer is not should be seen as a constant and active state, a relation dimension between artifacts of different natures. And this assumption became and can still be a powerful driver in design operations. There's also another idea. One could say that type does not carry denotative meaning, carries connotative meaning. The greenhouse, it is what it is. But what we saw throughout these pieces of writing, throughout these ideas, is that somehow the greenhouse, when put together with domestic space, carry some denotative meanings, carry some symbolic meanings. The effects are the same. Although we were looking at different contexts, historical contexts, very, very different, the feelings to the human pleasure of inhabited a house are very similar. At least this is what these testimonies would suggest. And certainly this is also a contribution to the theory of precedents within typological studies. And as a wider contribution, I recall the notion of countertype. Argan never really defined what is a countertype, but he talks about it, and he suggested that this can occur when one applies a typological solution to a program that is free from all typological precedents. And this, for him, somehow invention and typological operativeness seem to be inseparable. Invention in the sense of overtaken typal solutions where type has lost, and he says, I quote, lost any real value. In the cases that we've seen, to believe that some sort of typological innovation can emerge from this process and contribute to the development of architecture is not very far from believing that we can have a beach inside a museum. Thank you.
Someone. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, thanks very much. It's really enjoyable presentation. Maybe, I mean, one thing maybe I could offer, just some thoughts that I had going through the presentation. When you showed the stone, the arrowheads, one thing that struck me was, in this case, could type be understood as a kind of pattern or technique, a technique and pattern, a pattern of techniques, which is somehow how I would understand, you know, we can understand archaeology as tracing a certain historical set of tool making, etc., through a pattern of techniques. So with that in mind, I think what was really fascinating for me, and I'm not an expert in this, but I think is the relationship between the rise of greenhouses and the British colonial project as a whole milieu of techniques somehow. So I think I don't know if this is part of the research somewhere else, but, you know, for example, the transfer of a species from a distant place in a completely different climate, and the building of the knowledge of how, for example, breadfruit could be transferred from Asia to the Caribbean to support the colonial work of sugar plantations, for instance, and what role the greenhouse and perhaps the technologies surrounding the production of the greenhouse, but also the service infrastructure of the greenhouse start to facilitate the possibility for the transfer, not only of something to another context, but then somehow the relationship to the interior in the British context, even though I guess potentially that's where greenhouses maybe emerge somehow. So yeah, I find it really fascinating. I just wonder if this, you know, even, I mean, also the discussion of species, I think might even be pretty interesting to get into more depth, because, for example, we see palm trees in a lot of these examples, and the sort of understanding of the care of a palm tree, and yet we're in a context where the palm tree is precisely very much removed from the actual climactic situation of that context. So yeah.
No, I just wanted to follow up to your comment because I think there is something very interesting. I mean, first of all, I really enjoyed also as well. The presentation was really interesting and very clear. I think that to footnote the historical pedigree of the glass house or the as a sorry.
Oh, I thought you were saying the palm house.
No, I mean the archetype of the glass house as a colonial type, I think would be very beneficial to your argument, because in fact what happened with Lacaton Vassal, that they, although this word has become a bit to maybe abuse nowadays, they decolonize this type, because in fact they are not using it as a greenhouse, but they're using it exactly because it's abstraction, because it's, you know, like as you said, it's denotative rather than it's you know, it's programless nature in a way. And I think that for me is really interesting, because it's true that the glass house or the greenhouse is the colonial industrial type par excellence. And somehow, but I always found a little bit, I mean, I found your presentation, it's almost as if you build a theory for them. Because I always found, I mean, I think they're really great architects, but when it comes to argue their decisions, to me, it's not always like they're too literal. I mean, yeah, it looks good, it looks great. So, no, and I think you write a very convincing theory for them. So I don't know, they should use it now. But I think that what I found really striking is that they took this very charged type that has this strong kind of colonial industrial background, and they turn it into something, I mean, almost against its premises. And I think this is a really strong move, I mean, which I think now makes, for me, their work very convincing in a way, especially this early work. So I would definitely follow. I mean, I think this is a very important footnote. Maybe it's not your main argument, but it's an important footnote to your argument.
Yeah, I also thought the presentation was absolutely brilliant. And I think, I mean, there's actually two takeaways actually for me that I find really inspiring, that I mean, also for my own work, you know, beyond the amazing case study that you showed us. One is this idea that type can also be perverted in a way, can be reappropriated. So exactly what Pier Vittorio is saying, I think this is really beautiful that you show us. It's a typological transfer for sure, but I think it also implies that eventually maybe even the users actually can have some sort of agency. This I find very interesting, because what we've seen, for instance, in the case of Tia right before you, is really kind of a very top-down process in which type is really used to create subjects in a very direct way. I do think that that's the case in most cases, especially when it comes to domestic environments. But you are showing us that that's not necessarily a destiny, so that sometimes we can resemantize types, that we can, in a way, you know, that they are not a linear process that goes just in one direction, but it can be turned back. And that, I think, is very interesting. Of course, here the architects are doing it, so we still have an agent that is far above, in a way, the user, that is perverting the process in a positive sense. But I think we can extend that to think that this typological transfer could be something that eventually maybe not only architects can do, but, you know, that we do in fact actually in our everyday life, that in a way that type is not something rigid, it's something that can be resemantized. Which brings me to the second thing that I really appreciated in your presentation. You're kind of showing us that there are these kind of, you know, two possible definitions of type historically that are in tension with each other, one that is more formal and the other one that is more functional, right? And of course, neither of them is entirely correct. I mean, they are both partially correct, but they don't tell us the whole story. And I think that this was the premise of your presentation, which I completely agree with. And what I found particularly smart is that you try to undo this opposition between the two views on typology by bringing in the environment. Because then the environment is this kind of constant that stays throughout, and even when there is a dialectical relationship between function and form that don't stay in a way in a constant relationship with each other, but they keep shifting somehow, especially function, obviously, we do have this kind of red thread of the environment that kind of mediates between the two and becomes ultimately the real constant, if you want, actually, of type beyond the different uses and beyond the different formal definitions and so on and so forth. So I thought that these two principles, this principle of reappropriation or resemantization, if you want, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the idea that the environment can become really a category or a parameter through which we can rethink type differently. I thought that they were really powerful working instruments that can be, you know, beyond Lacaton and Vassal, really useful, I guess, to everyone else in this room. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, the only thing so I also think it was a very good analysis of a famous contemporary office. I was just wondering if the bois le prêtre, or that operation of adding greenhouse to an existing apartment, is not something different from the first projects you've shown, because it's really the adding something to an existing typology. While the other, I mean, the first cases, I was wondering if this not simply a sort of way of building in the countryside, houses in the countryside without building farms. So instead of building a farm, they simply build a sort of extension to a farm that is usually so normally you could say a farmer lives inside of his farm and he has greenhouses for cultivating the soil. But what they do is they don't build the farm, but they build the greenhouse to live. So it's another, in a way, it can tie in with Sila's presentation about suburbanization in that sense, because they try to find a way of building suburban houses, but not falling back on that agricultural type of the isolated farm. That's one. Yeah, one, and in that sense, it's different, I guess, from what happens in Tour Bois le Prêtre. That is really more something like a veranda or an extension of an existing house.
Yeah, but maybe to jump in this discussion and this quote, I think what we had also in the first presentation, that there is a transformation of a type in the territory, and when the type gets somehow independent and get used in a kind of different context, it's still the same type, but it creates other relationships. And as used in the agricultural field as a type and territory, it went to an urban type of, let's say, repetition of forms, which urban types anyway like that. Urban types are repetitions of multiple, let's say, copies finally also. And that is, I think, interesting to discover by this very clear line of let's say, also describing that. And I think I also appreciate the presentation, as it was also like, let's say, also a shooting of from all channels of possible ways to read typology. So even you quoted all of this kind of type recognitions what we had, and you started with the type is not a model. It was on the beginning, it was a model which get copied and copied. So it was kind of a critic on this kind of industrialization. And then also even it was the type as an image, what you also had in the last presentation, which poorly refers to this kind of question. So there, I think now, as everything is on the table, it would be really the question how to compose this in the fifth typology, or maybe to say, no, I cannot do this because I want to have them all parallel, and they're existing also in this kind of parallel manner. And we were not able to make a fifth typology because this is what happens today. Let's say, I think in architectural production, in reading, that the things are much more parallel, and there's just one thing which spits out and goes down. Even we have sometimes maybe a misinterpretation. We're looking at this Lacaton Vassal and we try to say them, yeah, it's so beautiful, it's agricultural, but finally, if I can also be very negative. So come on, they took an industrial type and they copied them to your carrier 50 times. So how boring is that? And we can also go much more, let's say, in a deep discussion, and we say, no, it's an extension of a poor window, and we extend the window, which we have now 2 glasses, 3 glasses, we're extending this in spaces, which is not discussed, let's say, in the presentation. I can do that, and I could also say, no, I'm extending the things to protect and to breathe. So there's another project, I think, of a German office who did a house which is, let's say, breathing. It has a core and it has these greenhouses around, and this was designed by thermal issues. So the greenhouse came by the question of thermal, let's say, in the sense of Marshall McLuhan, the domestic kept space is like this extension of the skin to invite other people to be with you. So that could be also interpreted in this, but then we are coming just more from the technical deconstruction of the type. And I think that is quite, maybe even this could be added in this kind of research, that to showcase the variety with one, everybody is looking at this kind of simplicity of one type. It's a greenhouse, but now it's a kind of universe on the end to respond to all of this questions.
I think that in that sense, I agree with Maria that the key issue is that for them is not the greenhouse as such that is important, but is the manipulation of the environmental conditions, basically. And it reminds me a discussion I had a few years ago with Peter Eisenman, where in fact, because I often used these early houses of Lacaton and Vassal as a reference for my students. Actually, I was teaching a studio. I taught for many years a studio, actually also with Maria on domestic space. And of course, we use these early projects by Lacaton and Vassal as an example of how to transcend the kind of typological rigidity of domestic space. And I was actually talking with Peter Eisenman, and he was very curious why I was so, he was surprised that I was very much into Lacaton and Vassal. And so I showed him these projects, and he told me something interesting. He said, you know, I'm not interested in their work because in their work, there are no corners. Meaning there are no these kind of solutions, architectural solution that you can find in, I don't know, Mies or Stirling, where, you know, the way the two walls meets, or, you know, these kind of tricks that in our own discipline, in a way, distinguish the architect from a very banal building, no? So basically the difference between architecture and building is that architecture, a corner is a corner, but is a corner in a special way. And of course, what they do completely destroy that kind of sort of an identity of architecture, because as Martin said, basically they're just appropriating a very banal typology brought in the market, basically. And there, the architectural intelligence doesn't rely on the corner. That's why Eisenman couldn't really understand what was so special about this architecture, but in the typological and I would say environmental manipulation that this very banal and cheap thing in a way provokes. And I think that's, for me, in your discussion is a crucial thing to say, that because this is actually what I think is the major innovation of their work. Is really this sort of shift from architecture of the material or the structure or the virtuosity of forma to architecture as an intelligence of environments and types, in a way, or as Maria said, or appropriation of types. Any question also? I mean, actually discussion, since this is the last presentation before lunch.
We have time.
We have enough time for this extra question. Also,
Vittorio is suggesting not to eat and to share food for thought.
No, we will eat them. But maybe there is also, looking back to the presentations that we had this morning.
I just maybe while you are thinking, trying to find Very sure, very good questions or discussions. I would like to thank you because all of your comments, some of them are half solved in my head, others are not solved yet. The question of the greenhouse as a colonial instrument. I think Pierre Vittori, because he helped me for that question, decolonization, which is quite interesting, but it was a process that was done by itself also, is that of course this greenhouse becomes also not only a very interesting idea of preserving lemon trees that could not stand our cold winters, preserving orange trees that could not stand our cold winters, but also they became a manifestation of power, of course. And which is quite interesting is that the fragility of the situation in terms of environmental control, some of them were heated, etc. There's a huge technique around it. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of literature, all of this evolved. They became symbol of power, but they also became very quickly democratized. Everyone could buy. There were catalogs when we had iron and glass. Everyone could buy his own greenhouse, and like you were saying, everyone could just buy a catalog, add it to their own house, and solve the problem and use it already. So this is very interesting, the way that this new solution became available to anyone that could afford it, and it was not that expensive. And another way that even before it got juxtaposed with the house, it was already explored as a reception area, small concerts. It's as this solution, this building solution was also already very vulnerable to the potential that it had. And then we'll know the Crystal Palace, etc., etc. So the question also is very interesting. We could go on discussing how type works, etc. Sometimes we are talking about types, but you are just talking about artifacts of a certain type, and we mix it a lot. It's a very big confusion, and I guess tomorrow, if we are not aware, if you are aware, we'll see how much we mixed typology, when sometimes you're just talking about artifacts that are variants or varieties of a type. And so this question of I think, like you said, we decolonize it, but also at that time it became already decolonized. It became much more important what you were doing in terms of domestic than what type of collection of colonial examples you would do it. So it began to evolve by itself. So this is quite interesting. Also because it was maybe just because very simple fragility thing. It's just glass and steel, nothing more. And also this also creates me a problem, is that Argan says be careful because grids are neutral, and neutral they're atypological. And so the greenhouse has zero particularity in terms of space. It relies only, and this was said, and it's very interesting, it only relies in environmental qualities of that space. It's like you create that buffer zone that allows you to expand your domestic space beyond the cold winters of European climates. And this is also very interesting, is that in terms of type, as from an Italian perspective, the structure, what is Borges, it's completely vanishes, and it's very sensitive. We even have a difficulty to say, show me a type of a greenhouse. We will rely immediately on the typal image.
Almost a non-type.
It's almost a non-type, yeah.
I completely agree, and I think it's super interesting. But the thing that keeps coming to my mind as well is the palm houses in Kew Gardens in London. These early greenhouses had mass infrastructures, big pipes, lots of hot water, lots of systems and machines running them. So I think for me also, what's coming up in the discussion is maybe the type of ground and infrastructure that we're also talking about when we talk about these examples. Because for me, it would be really interesting to see the manufacturing, the catalogs of these parts that are then being appropriated into this type, this space, this less defined technologically space, let's say sometimes. Because for example, I'll talk a little bit about Japan tomorrow. Japan didn't even have glass until the West came, and Western entrepreneurs introduced glass and started importing glass from Hong Kong to Japan, and then started building factories in Japan to produce glass, and therefore had to train a new class of workers to do that. So I think, I mean, also in the materiality and the systems, there's a real molding of a specific form of production and life in the city somehow. So I think, because I would guess, I don't know again about Q, but I would guess it really pushed the technological development of systems, of infrastructure, of materials like glass and metal and structure and things. So that's all being sort of, you know, squished to these planes or hidden under the ground at Q Gardens.
Yeah.
And in your cases, sometimes there's no soil, there's just stone on the ground, or there's concrete and there's no soil. But at Q, you have a floating soil bed, you know, really, really thick.
I think maybe I could speculate on the idea that the most the greenhouse got attached to domestic space, the more simple also it needed to be. And when it goes the other way around, the most opulent, the most complete, it also needed all that big tech, but to be affordable also need to take it out. And this, I will go into Christoph's question, which is quite interesting, is that it's a question that almost answers also in this premise, is this the minimum needed to create that extra space from inside out. It's very interesting to see the log ID talking about the movement inside out. It's very interesting to see that all the description of Lacaton Vassal's work is done inside out. Their work here at EPFL Design Studio was inside out. It's very interesting also, if you go through the image, it also becomes an inside out work. The photos of Philippe Rode are very clever and also celebrates what we could come to the Victorian picturesque, because it celebrates a certain picturesque domestic. You saw the iron, you saw on Mulhouse the first images, the trash can that the owner forgot to drop, or even the post-occupancy that we talked 5-10 years ago. We were talking about post-occupancy. They are doing that in their website, also relying on, look, 3 years after, let's look again at Mulhouse. And they present several of photos where, again, they are celebrating a kind of picturesque, which is kind of also interesting, this domestic picturesque of the 20th century, comparing to the greenhouse and the picturesque in England. I think that's why I was saying there's so much loose ends that some of them I still don't know to which extent they enter another dimension, or they can still be put inside. And this to finish, there is one thing that I didn't want to put forward because I think it still needs to mature, is this idea that there is an economy, there is in the sense of management of the household, very interesting, again, from inside out. And I would say that if we talk about economics and not economy, I think Lacaton Vassal, they are putting together, they never mentioned it, but I think they are putting together a certain management of the household from inside out that takes into account the economic dimension, not economy, but economic dimension. And this I'm trying to label it as a tyconomic perspective, fusioning a little bit the idea of working how types can be operative. And in this case was this idea of exploring from a transfer perspective that can go beyond their work, because I think it goes beyond their work and can unlock a lot of potential to work.
I mean, to me, the other brilliant thing actually this shows us is that we know that historically actually type is a concept that comes up as a weapon for us as architects when we are becoming irrelevant, right? Because when, engineers are better than us, so hey, but we are the masters of type, right? Or, industry has one over us, but hey, we are the masters of type, right? The city is kind of, running all over the place. We cannot control it anymore. We are not designing it anymore, but we are the masters of type. And actually here you show us a type that was completely, or a non-type rather, where they expose them completely to this fragility of the architect of accepting the fact that, yeah, maybe we are not even the masters of the type, but we are just very good at curating, in fact, actually, which they are very good at least, actually, at curating all of that. So I really like this kind of, the moment of vulnerability where we also acknowledge the fact that, at the end of the day, type has been a legal if actually for architects to justify our existence in a world that maybe, the jury is still out on whether the word beneath us or not, going back to Peter's point about actually the corner, because we are not even designing corners anymore, right? So I think this opens a whole other host of questions on what is the political instrumentality of type, what has been the political instrumentality of type in justifying our profession until today, and what maybe could be in the future. And that to me is very thought-provoking, because I like to think that the article, up to a certain degree, is still needed, even when it's pressed in by technology on the one side and economic considerations on the other side. And so how can we again re-weaponize somehow type if this is the right instrument? Because maybe the answer might be maybe type is not the instrument anymore, and maybe you know, we might be aligned with that idea, right? That maybe it's the time to look for new reasons actually where the world needs us. But I mean, I love that you brought the question on the table, and of course the other fantastic work.
Yeah, to point to, I'm not coming from a typological perspective in general, I think the work that I'm doing, but what I really like in your presentation was the fact that I could say type as something that comes from the physicality of space. And the fact also that I really love this part where you mentioned how it has been experienced by someone living in a greenhouse, and that they start talking about non-human things, like the plants. And for me, that's quite interesting. Like we see that it could be probably a new type that we are really trying to also pursue in architecture that has to do with the physics of space, with the physicality of that. Even Eisman was talking about the interiority as something that was related to the physics. So apart from the exteriority and anteriority, that I mean, because I had him in my mind before even was mentioned. So I really like that, the symbiosis, the fact that you can think further, because I think type and typology is a very human-centric medium of thinking about architecture and bringing the physics as well as the aesthetics. Such an amazing space, or I don't know if it's amazing, but so diverse in its microclimate. I think it's very, very interesting.
It's also, sorry, it's also just to add that it's inside outside perhaps as well. I don't know, there's something really interesting about this.
Yeah, I think that they used to use a lot this metaphor of putting layers of, you never put the worm, you don't know how it will be tomorrow, and they say tomorrow it will certainly be wonderful weather, but you also put layers and you take them accordingly to your needs, and this to empower you to empower the inhabitant to explore this according to his own needs is quite interesting. And then we could go through, there are European program called rooftop greenhouses, where again we are exploring this potential of this type to be implemented to improve energetic performance also of the building. So I think there is, of course, a lot of potential to uncover it. I'm more interested, of course, in this tension of how can you operatively explore type in a meaningful way, and it's true that in their way it's kind of makes you wonder.